Okay, so we can get everyone seated. Maybe a few folks still outside. So we'll continue from where we left off last week, looking at the incommunicable attributes of God. Does anyone remember what incommunicable means? Incommunicable.
There's nothing else or no one else or no other being that has the same attributes.
Yeah, so it's incommunicable in the sense of like it cannot be transferred to anyone else. So the incommunicable attributes of God are the attributes that are exclusively God's, and we cannot share in it in any way. So that means, what is an example of an incommunicable attribute? Remember, we said God is self-existent, right? He has life in himself. Exactly. So all of these attributes, even though we may be able to understand it, we cannot share in it. We don't know. We might know what it means, but it is not possible for us to actually say that about ourselves, that we are self-existent, we are self-sufficient, and that, God is eternal is an incommunicable attribute. Why is God's eternality not communicable given that we have everlasting life? He has no beginning, exactly. Right? Eternality means no beginning, no end. Whereas human beings, even if when we have got immortality, as the Bible says, as Vijay was saying in the sermon today, right, in 1 Corinthians, if you read 1 Corinthians 15, it says the perishable will put on immortality. That's what human beings. But even then, we will still have a beginning in time. Therefore, we are not eternal. But we could say we have everlasting life at that point. Some of the other incommunicable attributes, God is immutable. What does immutable mean? Does not change, right? And one of the things about the attributes of God is that you can see that they are attributes of every person of the Godhead. Okay, there is no attribute of God that is not shared in by every person of the Godhead. Okay, there are attributes that are unique to Jesus Christ, which are exclusively tied to what? His incarnation. So that is not shared by the other persons of the Godhead. So the attributes that are exclusively the Son's due to his incarnation. But the attributes that are Jesus by deity are also true of the Father and of the Spirit, and vice versa, and so on. So we said God is immutable. God is impassible. Impassible means he's not influenced by emotions. Okay? So we said it's not that, sometimes people say God is not passionate. That's not true. It just means that God acts and thinking is not influenced by passion. Unlike human beings, right? When we say we are passionate, we leave open the opportunity for our actions to be influenced by our emotion. Like in our anger or in our joy or whatever, we might do things that we were not going to do. Okay? But in God's case, he is not someone who is influenced in that way by emotions. At the same time, he shows emotions. We see that in the scriptures. That is a facet of his personality. Okay? The God of the scriptures is different from the God of other religions because he is a personal God, and being personal involves the emotions, the passions we see in the scriptures, and so on. We said God is free. What does that mean? God is free. And that is not a communicable attribute. Limited by? Yeah, so God is free. So this is different from God is, let's say, omnipotent. Like God is powerful. God is free means that he's not bound by obligations outside of the ones that he has committed himself to, or the ones that are essential to his nature. Okay, that means he is not he's not subject to any rule of law. As an example, right? We are bound by what we call the rule of law, which is external to us. That's an obligation that we have. God is not bound to anything external to himself. So then someone will say, can God do evil? The answer is no. That is not an expression of freedom that God can do evil, because in doing evil, he would cease to be God. But he is not bound by a standard that is outside of himself. You see our question?
So we can't say, in this case, that God bound to his own obligation.
Yeah, the ones that he enters into himself of his own free will. That's what we call a covenant. Yeah, once he has made a covenant out of his own free will, he binds himself to that because it is in his nature to, as we said, he is an unchanging God, right? And so on. But he's not obliged to enter into that covenant, right? Or he's not obliged by anything outside of himself. So he's the only free being in the universe in that sense. That has no obligations outside of himself. And that will become important when we talk of things like omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence. Because typically we associate the word free with something like free choice or free will, right? But ultimately, every other freedom that every creature has is bound in some way. And God is not in that same way. Can I get a napkin? Sorry. Yeah, no, they are all tied together. So, one of the attributes of God is that we said God is simple, and we said, in the English language, nowadays the word simple just means someone who is a simpleton, right? Has very limited faculties. But when we say God is simple, it means that we cannot divide God into parts. So technically, you cannot say the love of God can be understood apart from the justice of God and things like that. So God is the one, sometimes for things we say, oh, he's greater than the sum of his parts. That's supposed to be a good characteristic of people, right? Or a company or something like that. But God is not like that. He's not the sum of his parts. He's not greater than the sum of his parts. He's uniquely simple in the sense that he cannot be divided. So when we talk of all these attributes, it's a condescension to us so that we can understand who God is and what God is, right? But it's not like there is, it's not like, there are these 15 attributes of God, you add them together, you get God. It's not like that, right? The attributes are essential to God. And we said the incommunicable attributes are tied to what God is, that is his being. And you'll see that the communicable attributes like love, holiness, and so on are tied to who God is, his person. So that's why they are communicable, because we also have personality, so we can also partake of some of those attributes. Okay, so we left the main three incommunicable attributes last week because we didn't have time, so we'll cover those today. Wrench, can I get the... So the first one is omniscience. All right, this should be very well known to all of us. What does omniscience mean? Omni means all, exhaustive, whatever. But all knowing, right? Science, omniscience. But omniscience means that He's all knowing. That's a simple way to put it. Okay, what types of knowledge does God have exhaustively? Like what all does God know? Okay, we say He knows everything. What does that mean? Okay. Okay, so in terms of time, right? Past, present, future. Okay, that's simple, right? In terms of scope, you could say anyone, anywhere, anything, right? Like knowledge of everything in terms of who is doing what, that kind of thing. It's not limited to just human beings and so on. But there's also the aspect of, we said past, present, and future. What other types of knowledge can exist? Okay, so now, you're all looking at the soccer game, right? It's 2-2. So if you notice, in most of these newer sports applications, they will give you win probability. Have you seen it? So when Argentina was leading 2-0, their win probability was probably depending on time and so on, right? Like it's a computer that's calculating it, would have been like very high, 80%, 90%. When France scored the first goal, that win probability drops, but Argentina would still be favored. When France scored the second goal, it'll go back closer to like 50%, right? So that is a type of knowledge as well, like probabilistic knowledge. So when we say God is omniscient, He also has exhaustive knowledge of all the infinite possibilities and probabilities that can exist, which means what would have happened if I chose to do this instead of doing something else. Get what I'm saying? Like when there is a choice, let's say, and you say you have two choices, God knows which choice I'm going to make, as well as what would have happened if I have chosen the other one. So it is not uncertain to Him of all the possibilities. And we get all that from Scripture, but basically He has exhaustive knowledge of everything past, present, future, and the almost infinite possibilities of what could happen or could have happened. So that's the full scope of divine omniscience. That's why it's an incommunicable attribute, because not only because of everything past, present, and future, in which case, because past, present, okay, we might not know everything, but you know some things, past and present. You can predict some things maybe in the future, but God knows it with a perfection that we can never have, or we can never claim to have. So, there are many verses. Isaiah chapter 46, verse 9 to 10. Someone wants to read that?
Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose.
Right. So, there's a lot of verses like that, but if you systematically study it, the concept of divine omniscience is God's exhaustive knowledge in every aspect. Okay. So what is the main objection people have against divine omniscience? Presence of evil, yeah, is one, but typically people have that against omnipotence, right? If God is all-powerful, why doesn't He stop? Yeah, exactly. So the main apologetic challenge, you could say, of omniscience is tied to the idea of freedom in creatures, like human beings and so on, right? If God knows everything that is going to happen, and He knows all the possibilities, then in what sense do we have free choice or free will? Okay? So that's the main arguments that people will come up with, and we don't have time to go into all of it. So there's a lot of ways people have tried to address it, right? You have the idea of some people call it foreknowledge, right? Which is very tied to this idea that God is looking ahead into time and then bringing back that knowledge to Himself. Which is, if you read the scriptures, it's never articulated that way, and it seems a little, it's not like God, at some point, because God is about time, right? It's not like God at some point is like, oh, I don't know what Gio is going to eat for breakfast tomorrow. Let me fast forward in time and then bring that knowledge back to Himself. It doesn't really make that much sense. Some people have talked about middle knowledge, which is God knows all the possibilities, but then He ordains things in such a way that you choose the one that that will lead to the outcomes that He desires. So it's more like He will arrange things, Let's say, it's not a proper example, but let's say you had 3 choices of cereal or whatever, and by the time you reach there, only one of them was available because the kids, they finished the other 2. So the middle knowledge would be that, God would have seen the 3 choices, knew which one you were going to pick, and then ordain things in such a way that you would only pick that one. Again, not completely satisfactory. Sorry, you have a question? Yeah.
So it's like a future tense, and it's saying that I will do this, even though Pharaoh chooses to do that.
Yeah.
Maybe that's something they use for this.
Yeah. So the thing with the God is, we talked about this last week. We actually cannot fully understand what it means to be above space and time. So at this point, we are all making assumptions, right? We are tying things in sequence, which to God, things don't really happen in sequence unless He chooses to engage, within space and time. And we'll talk about that when we talk about omnipresence. So, and the other thing with knowledge is that, it's interesting, people don't really think about it this way because, why would we? But actually, any certain knowledge is fully deterministic. That means if you know something for certain, it's not going to change. That's why certainty is key. So let's say the best example of this is, if I knew that you came from India yesterday, right? The very fact that I know means that fact will never change. Does that make sense? Okay? So in human beings' case, it's because we are limited to time and space, our knowledge is tied in, let's say, like sequence. But if you take out the aspect of sequence and you just say this is certain knowledge, you cannot change it. So a lot of like movies and stories about time travel is trying to go against that idea, right? Like what's the main thesis behind time travel movies, especially ones that are going back into the past? It is to create, yeah, exactly. It's because the idea is that something has happened, and that makes that past certain. So they have to go back in time and create a new kind of ripple or whatever in order to have new possibilities. So philosophically, that's one of the key things when you talk of knowledge, is that any knowledge that is certain fundamentally determines actions or choices. So in that case, in God's omniscience, how are human beings said to have, like you said in Pharaoh's example, said to have free choice? We might not be able to fully understand how everything works, but what most Christian theologians and Bible teachers will say is that when we talk of free choice as if, oh, God knows it, therefore there's a gun to my head. Therefore I will do it. Right? But that's not how it actually works in real life. When you make the choices that you make, you don't, no one, maybe in your life you have had actual situations where somebody has put a gun to your head. I'm not presuming. But in reality, at that point, all of your choices are still free because you're still acting upon your emotions, the details that you have, the information that you have, and nobody's forcing you to do it. Right? We understand that God knows. But the key aspect is that you cannot claim that somebody forced me to do it. Right? Like, you can make the argument that because God knows, I cannot do anything else. But that is not what freedom of choice is. Right? Freedom of choice is, did someone force you to do this? Right? That's the typical way you look at choice. If somebody is forcing you to do something, you have no choice. If you are free to act, then you have choice. So, come to you. So that's why we said when God is free, it's an incommunicable attribute. Because nobody else is free in the same way that God is. But at the same time, we still have freedom. It is still self-determining, regardless of God's omniscience.
I was just thinking through this, right? The fact that God knows all possibilities and probabilities. Like, so this moment in reality, me sitting here, could I argue the best probability in God's mind?
No. It's not about the best or something like that. It's not about, there's a perfection in one choice versus the other. It just means that, the almost infinite possibilities that could have happened here, like how many people came, right? You didn't come, but you came, all that kind of things. God knows all of that. But He knows what happens actually, and He knows what could have happened, and so on. Okay. So basically, you don't need to know all of that too, but you have to, it's an article of faith that God has exhaustive knowledge, right? And so when we argue or when we debate these things with others, we are not trying to make the case for why this is true. We are arguing from the fact that it is true, and we are trying to maybe understand, all the ramifications and so on.
I think all cultures have this omniscience character that's there because every culture has a way of understanding prophecy. And if there's a prophecy and it comes to be true, then whatever medium that you regard the prophecy from, it's deterministic, right?
Yeah.
So I wonder why people from different cultures would argue because each belief system has this prophecy.
Yeah, I think, part of it is like our culture today is very tied to uncertainty, right? So, someone can say things like, you look at Big Bang Theory, right? How much of that is technically certain, with the 100% is it's all a matter of probabilities at that point. So, in that culture, for someone to be making an exclusive claim of some kind, whether that's a truth claim or a certainty of knowledge is fundamentally alien to such cultures. Okay, and at least with Jewish and Christian philosophy, it is the exhaustiveness of that which is different, right? Compared to like other religions where they might know some things well, but not other things, right? There's a god of the sea, or the god of the skies, or god of war, or whatever. But even then they are limited. But with our God, that is not the case. Okay. Next attribute, omnipresence. Okay, what is omnipresence? All present, okay. Okay, Psalm 139, verse 7 to 9.
Where shall I go from your spirit, and where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me.
Yes. So, omnipresence is basically God is present everywhere at all times without any compromise. Okay? So, every time we talk of one of the attributes of God, you don't necessarily have to qualify it, but you have to understand it. God is not, it doesn't diminish God's power in any way that He's present everywhere. Okay? It's like sometimes, what's a common complaint that human beings have? When you have a lot of things to do on your plate, you're stretching yourself too thin, right? Right? So as your scope or your presence expands, something else, it's like an equation. Something else has to go down. But that's not the case for God. That means in His omnipresence, He's present everywhere at all times without any compromise to His attributes. Okay? And there are many ways in which you can understand the presence of God, right? But the two common ways is, we talked about this, transcendence. Okay? What is transcendence? Transcendence means that God is separate from all of His creation. That is, His presence transcendent. He has a transcendent presence. That is, there's an aspect of His presence that is outside of our created world, which we can never understand or never comprehend. That's what we call transcendence. Okay, what is the other aspect of God's presence? Immanence. Okay. What does immanence mean? Yeah, but technically it means he's at the same time he's transcendent, he's everywhere present within creation, sustaining it by His power. So Acts chapter 17, verse 24 to 28. This is Paul's apologetic speech to the Greeks, and he talks about God's immanence here. Acts 17, 24 to 28.
The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is He served by human hands as though He needed anything, since He Himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of the dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward Him and find Him. Yet He is actually not far from each one of us, for in Him we live and move and have our being, as some of your own poets have said.
Okay. So what Paul is arguing here is that obviously that you have to understand the transcendence of God. But if God was not immanent, that He was not present within creation, sustaining it by His power, then creation itself would not exist. So one of the things that sometimes people make the mistake is that they believe that before Jesus Christ came into the world, God was only transcendent. And it's only in the incarnation that he became immanent. That's not true. Right? Immanence and transcendence means, one is God is separate from creation. The other one, God is present within creation. That has always been true since the beginning of creation. Now, in the case of the incarnation, God is immanent in a very specific, special way, which is that he, the second person of the Trinity comes into this world and is incarnated as a human being. But that does not mean that God was not immanent prior to that. Sorry, Nisha.
There's some similarities, I guess, as well as, feel free to correct me, but like Hinduism, right? They'd say like God is in the tree, God is in the chair, God is in you. So would we say it's kind of similar there, or no?
So that's the last word, right? The last part of that phrase, that God's transcendence means that he cannot be confused with his creation. Okay? That is, he does not merge with entities in a way that provides deity to them, right? So that's why that is pantheism, or pantheism is like God is in everything, which means that that thing has an attribute of divinity because God is in it. What we can say though is that there are aspects of God's immanence which provide benefits to human beings, especially those, obviously one benefit is that everyone can live and breathe, right? Like Paul was saying. If God was not immanent, that would not be possible. But then there are benefits that are unique to believers, right? One benefit is that God is present in a special way among his people in order to bless them, right? So when we say where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I in the midst of them, it's not just an attribute of like, we know that, right? We know God is present. So then why would it be a special thing for us to say where 2 or 3 are gathered, there am I in the midst? Because that presence brings with it blessing, right? Not just the fact that God is present. So when we talked of the Holy Spirit, your body is the temple of God. That's under, you could say, benefit that believers have from God's presence that is not shared with unbelievers, right? Then, so there are things like that, but we would never confuse it to say that, like Mormonism says that, when you're redeemed, you're on the path to being what? Become God. But that would go against God's transcendence. So transcendence and immanence basically means that God exists separate from his creation and at the same time he's present within his creation. Any questions?
We say body, spirit, and soul. So Hinduism says that every object has a soul, living or non-living. But in Christianity, we say living creatures have spirit and body, and humans have soul because God breathes into us. And so only humans can be free. Right? So there's that difference.
Yeah, I don't know if there are people, there's tripartite and bipartite. So tripartite, people believe that there's body, soul, spirit. Bipartite believe that there's body and soul and spirit refers to the same thing. But regardless of, the uniqueness of human beings is the fact that we are made in God's image, not in our constitution, right? So that means we have a personality that is made, specifically to bear God's image, and that brings some moral obligations, which we broke. That is why there's a need for salvation, right? It's not necessarily tied to, what is the makeup of our beings. So
This nefesh has two animals have nefesh, or is nefesh only a human attribute of humans?
no, you're asking him, right? That's cool. Yeah.
So what's interesting, so if you turn to Genesis chapter 1, yeah, this one. There's a verse that why don't you continue? I'll come back. You can just find the verse.
All right.
I'll answer you. Okay.
Yes, the last one is omnipotence, right? Potency means power. So what does omnipotence mean? He's all powerful. But as you will see, right, it means that nothing external to God can limit God's absolute power to do as He wills. So it's all tied together. This is that classic, I was in engineering school and someone came and asked me, oh, can God create a stone that's too heavy for Him to lift? Right? This is I proved that God is not all powerful. Right? Oh, because one way or the, it's like but the thing is, that's not what omnipotence means, right? Doesn't mean that God does something that makes Him not God. It means that nothing outside of God can limit God's power to do as He wills. Okay? So, Psalm 135, verse 5 and 6.
For I know that the Lord is great, and that our Lord is above all gods. Whatever the Lord pleases, He does, in heaven and on earth, in the seas and all deep.
Yep. So, whatever the God pleases to do, He does. Again, unless He doesn't do anything that will not align with His being. Okay. So there are some implications of God's omnipotence. Right. The first one is that God is fully sovereign. So sovereignty. When we talk of sovereignty, it is the ability of God to make things come to pass according to His will. Right? So sovereignty is not necessarily, again, you can't divide it, but it's more an attribute of His all-powerful nature than of the other attributes. Okay? Second implication is that, similar to omniscience, human will is free, but it is limited. Okay? So if your definition of freedom is that there will be no limitation, then such a thing is not possible for any creature. Because if that is the case, then you are God. But at the same time, as we see in the scriptures, human will is free in the sense of it being free in your perspective. Okay? And there is this thing called, in the Bible, if you read especially, not just the Old Testament, the New Testament, we call it compatibilism. Compatibilism is like there's a tension that exists, which we do not know how it resolves, between divine sovereignty and human responsibility. Okay, that is, God is fully sovereign, yet He does not absolve human beings of their responsibility in making those choices. Now, how can you fully reconcile it? You cannot. That's why it is called that there's a tension, right? And when we say compatible, it just means that these two doctrines in the scriptures at least are compatible, that God is fully sovereign and at the same time there is human responsibility. But if you go outside and tell that to someone, they will not believe you. So it's not a winning argument to try and debate someone in a way that ascribes to them freedom by limiting the sovereignty of God. Right? Because if you're limiting the sovereignty of God in order to prove a point to some person, you are limiting something that God claims for himself. Sorry, Nishant.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, like, they say human will is created in somewhat or all ways. And I think in building humanity is this pursuit of, like, I want to be able to overcome the restrictions that are placed upon me, right? Like, so when it comes to disease or when it comes to age, right? Like, I think now it's like, how can we make sure that we edit the genome to live longer? In fact, not have an age restriction, right? So would one argue that that's not the right pursuit for human beings to pursue?
I think, so you're asking the question, as some people say, is it right for human beings to play God or something like that? I think that argument is less about can human beings do it and more about should human beings do it. And so it's less of a argument of power than it is an argument of moral responsibility. So, for example, we have, Canada is the most permissive country in the world when it comes to euthanasia. It means in the most liberal, what do you think is the most liberal state in the United States? California. In California, in 2021, there were 450 or something incidents where people committed euthanasia, like they determined to end their life, okay? And it happened. How many do you think there were in Canada? Take a guess. In 2021. $10,000. Yeah, since 2016, in Canada, about 35,000 people have died through euthanasia. Okay? So the question asking when you say, oh, is that right to play God, is less about whether we have the technology to do that. Right? If euthanasia was something which was like, oh, I'll have to cut off your head, very few people will be willing to do it. Right? Like, it's like a guillotine, right? Like you have to put your head here, No, but it's because it's like a injection or whatever, and you're, dreaming of, you're listening to music or whatever, you're surrounded by family, it's very peaceful, and then you die. That is technology, right? Like that's science. So it's less a question of can you do it, and more a question of whether you should do it. Because what you'll see is that that's a great moral tragedy, right? Where someone was saying this country has dedicated hotlines for people who are in a suicidal state, so they can call a number and be talked out of committing suicide. At the same time, they also give that person the opportunity to go to a doctor and commit suicide. See, when human beings enter into the realm of these kinds of moral decision making, it reveals our kind of like our incoherence. We cannot square the two things. So whether we should play God is over time we'll have more and more technology. Maybe we'll go to new planets and so on and so forth, right? It's less a question of that and more about whether we should do it. Because you'll probably lose something fundamental to humanity when we do those things. Okay. All right. The last point of that is, the Bible says, as in James, that God is not the author of evil, right? That means in His sovereignty, He's not responsible for evil in the same way that He is responsible for things that are good. Okay, and so typically people say this in the terms of God allows or permits evil to happen, but He enables or He empowers non-evil things. Okay, now this is one of those things where if you think a lot about it, you'll end up in a lot of difficulties, right? Because when we say God allows evil, He's still allowing it, right? So if that is the case, doesn't that make Him responsible in some way? That's a question that's that question, right? Why are there so many tragedies, typhoons, whatever, right? But the Bible is emphatic in saying that, there are things that God cannot do, right? What are some of the things that God cannot do? He cannot lie, He cannot sin, He cannot deny Himself, or He cannot be tempted with evil. So the way this is expressed is that how sovereignty interacts with good and evil is understood in different ways, right? There is no moral culpability to God for evil things, as opposed to the praise and glory that comes to Him from good things. Okay, and we'll probably talk more about it, just about this, because I think it's an important point to clarify. But we should never end up in a situation where we are trying to defend one point or the other, and the only way to do that is either make God the author of evil, or you do the other thing, which is that God is completely divorced. Einstein's God. I know, there was a philosopher called Spinoza. The idea that God has created the world and then just left it to operate on its own whims and fancies. So you shouldn't go one way or the other, right? How you are able to define that is a great challenge, but you still have to stay true to what the Scripture says. And when we started this, we said this is a way for us to grow in our worship of God, really it's very hard unless you have faith to talk about those things and not be completely sidetracked.
So if you turn to Genesis chapter 1 verse 30, I think it's a very interesting story there. So it's quite exhaustive, but I want to capture just a little bit. When you look at 130, it says, "And to every beast of the earth, and every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the spirit and soul into a body. We're capturing too much in that verse, which is not clarified till we go to the progressive definition. So my focus was that we seem to see ourselves just as a soul, but it's important to see a whole body, a whole person. Okay, so I think we'll probably at some point in time we can go back and connect and see what progressively what we understand. For now,
Right. Any other questions? Okay, I think we'll cover some of the questions outstanding in another session because this was just like a survey, but it looks specifically at some of the points. Okay. Right, Nishant,
I
sorry.
think brother was saying how in Arabic nefes actually means breath.
Yep.
Gives the breath.
Nish, can you close in prayer?